Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Geneva Press Club. My name is Isabelle Falconier and I'm the director of Geneva Press Club. Welcome to those following online too. And welcome to this conference and event entitled Business and Human Rights in Japan. Last year, the members of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights conducted an official visit to Japan and had a dialogue with various stakeholders concerning business and human rights. Their official report was submitted to the 56th Human Rights Council. Today's event invites working group members to talk about this report and also other report recommendations, as well as NGOs dedicated to addressing the problem. And I have now the great pleasure to give the floor to our today's moderator, Mr. Calvin Queant, who is also the Geneva representative of the NGO Human Rights Now. Calvin, you have the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and esteemed panelists, good afternoon, and welcome to this Human Rights Council side event on business and human rights in Japan. My name is Calvin Queant, Human Rights Now's Geneva representative, and I am honored to serve as your moderator today, facilitating a dialogue that seeks to address pressing issues at the intersection of business practices and human rights in Japan. The official report submitted on the 56th Human Rights Council underscores the urgency of dismantling structures of inequality and discrimination against at-risk groups. It sheds light on persistent sexual abuses within the entertainment industry, exemplified by the Johnny Kitagawa case, and the report also revisits the critical issues of human rights violations affecting people and workers impacted by the Fukushima nuclear disaster. Significant challenges remain despite calls and recommendations from UN mandate holders and the civil society. Today, we are privileged to have an esteemed panel of speakers who will delve into those critical topics. Members of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Mr. Matt Corcodell, the chairperson of the working group, and Ms. Yeophantong, member from Asia-Pacific states of the working group, who's been working with Human Rights Now extensively on the issues at hand. They will present their findings from the 2023 country visit to Japan and share recommendations for advancing human rights in business practices. Mr. Nihongi, from One is Too Many, Action Plans to Eradicate Child Sexual Abuse, will address human rights violations within the entertainment industry and outline action plans to eradicate child sexual abuse. Ms. Sonoda, from Human Rights Now, will shed lights on the ongoing issues concerning the Fukushima Nuclear Power Plant and the human rights implication for affected workers and individuals. Mr. Kasai, from the Asia Program Officer at Human Rights Watch, will discuss the ties between major Japanese companies and serious human rights abuses in China and Myanmar. And finally, Ms. Ito, which is the Vice President at Human Rights Now, will provide insight into the overall challenges faced in implementing the business and human rights agenda in Japan. Our event aims to foster dialogue, raise awareness, and encourage actionable steps. We have the privilege of hearing from survivors, experts, and advocates who amplify the voices of those directly impacted by business practices. Following their presentation, we will open the floor for a Q&A session, allowing you, our audience, to engage directly with our panelists. But before we proceed, I would like to express our gratitude to the co-sponsors of this event, Human Rights Watch and the Geneva Press Club. Your support enables us to convene this critical conversation, and together we can drive positive change and ensure that business practices align with human rights principles. Without further ado, let us begin our conversation towards a more just and equitable Japanese business landscape, one that respects and upholds the fundamental rights of all individuals. Thank you. So we will start with Ms. Yeophantong from the Business and Human Rights Working Group. She will present online.
I will take that as a yes. Great. So as I am joining you from Canberra, Australia, I would like to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people as the traditional custodians of the lands on which I speak. I pay my respects to Ngunnawal elders, past, present, and emerging, and thank them for their continuing care of country and community. My name is Pichamon Yeophantong, and I am the member from Asia Pacific states on the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. Many thanks to Human Rights Now, Human Rights Watch, and the Geneva Press Club, the organizers of this Human Rights Council side event, for providing the UN Working Group with this valuable opportunity to share our insights on the topic of business and human rights in Japan in light of our recent country visit. I would also like to thank my working group colleague, Robert McWorkadale, who is our member from Western Europe, European and other states, and our current chairperson, and who will be delivering later on the closing remarks on behalf of the working group. Before proceeding further with these opening remarks, though, I would like to take a moment here to acknowledge the presence of Akimasa Nihongi-san, along with the human rights defenders and business and human rights practitioners joining in person and online today, and applaud them for their tireless efforts to raise much-needed awareness to advance the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights in Japan. It takes an incredible amount of courage to speak out about business-related human rights abuses, especially when you have had to endure such abuses firsthand. The Working Group on Business and Human Rights is comprised of 5 members of balanced geographical representation. As independent experts who work as part of a fact-finding and monitoring mechanism of the UN Human Rights Council, we hold the mandate from states to promote, disseminate, and implement the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Adopted unanimously in 2011 by the Human Rights Council, the Guiding Principles set out the duty of states to protect human rights, the responsibility of all businesses to respect human rights, and the need to ensure access to effective remedies. We fulfill our mandate by engaging in a range of activities, including conducting country visits, issuing communications, and convening the UN Annual Forum on Business and Human Rights. The working group visited Japan at the invitation of the government of Japan from the 24th of July through to the 4th of August 2023. The aim of the visit was to assess the business and human rights situation in Japan, including the implementation of the guiding principles there. The visit included meetings with government officials, businesses, civil society representatives, and members of at-risk groups to understand the efforts and challenges in Japan in relation to business and human rights. At the end of our visit, the working group produced an end-of-mission statement with preliminary findings, which has served as the basis for the current country visit report that was presented by Robert earlier today to the Human Rights Council. The working group's report and country visit followed the Special Procedures, Manual of Operations, and Code of Conduct. The information contained in our report was carefully triangulated for verification purposes, including through multi-stakeholder consultations that were held prior to, during, and after our country visit. The government of Japan also had multiple opportunities to engage with the working group and provide information on all topics, including when reviewing the draft report. And they have since provided public comments in response to our report, which can be found on the working group's webpage. We would strongly encourage the government to also engage with businesses, civil society, and victims of business-related human rights abuses through meaningful consultations so that the government may gain further insights into the information that was shared with the working group. And now let me turn to some highlights from our report. In our country visit report, we welcomed the important advances by the government of Japan in relation to business and human rights, including the fact that Japan is the second Asia-Pacific country to develop a national action plan on business and human rights. The guidelines on respecting human rights in responsible supply chains is, moreover, a positive development in terms of rendering even more practical the government's guidance to businesses. Indeed, the working group looks forward to seeing a second national action plan being issued in the very near future. Alongside these positive steps, the working group expressed concern, however, about the systemic human rights challenges that Japan continues to face, particularly in relation to deeply embedded, harmful gender and social norms that can manifest in the form of workplace discrimination, harassment, and marginalization against at-risk groups. These concerns are yet to be adequately tackled as part of state and private sector initiatives in the business and human rights space, and therefore present an opportunity for further improvement. The working group also found significant gaps in understanding and in the implementation of human rights due diligence across value chains, particularly in conflict-affected situations and especially among small and medium-sized enterprises that contribute considerably to the country's economic activity, but which often lack the resources and guidance needed to conduct human rights impact assessments. We also observed how increased efforts are needed to encourage the uptake of the guiding principles by general trading, companies, and retailers, which are especially well positioned to exercise their leverage in a variety of sectors. But as the primary duty bearer, the government plays a critical role in protecting human rights and in setting clear expectations for businesses to respect human rights throughout their operations, both at home and abroad, in line with the guiding principles. As per the guiding principles, it is necessary for the government to ensure policy coherence between human rights obligations and actions with respect to business, as well as develop robust legal frameworks, including mandatory human rights due diligence measures to complement voluntary guidelines as part of a smart mix. The working group further noted the government's opportunity to strengthen efforts among state-owned enterprises to implement the guidelines and, by extension, the guiding principles. Equally important is the need to ensure accessible and suitable judicial and non-judicial grievance mechanisms to enhance access to justice and to effective remedies. In terms of the issues covered, our report identified how at the crux of the challenges faced by at-risk stakeholder groups are the lack of diversity and inclusion in the labor market on the one hand, and the prevalence of discrimination, harassment, and violence in the workplace and society on the other. Indeed, beyond the moral imperative to ensure inclusion, inequality can be economically and politically damaging. And so to achieve sustainable growth and to leave no one behind, as per the Agenda 2030, it is important for government policies and business activities to champion inclusion and social justice by reaching at-risk peoples who are often those furthest behind first. Of particular relevance to the conversation today, the working group also looked into key thematic areas of concern or interest by probing specific cases that are emblematic of the many serious concerns repeatedly raised by stakeholders. These range from the cases of PFAS contamination and the redevelopment of the Meiji Jingu-gaen, through to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, the treatment of migrant workers, and human rights issues in the media and entertainment industry. I believe we will be hearing more from other speakers today about ongoing issues related to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster and the implications from the Smile Up case, so I won't discuss them at length here in the interest of time. I do want to note, however, that these are ongoing cases and that effective remedies still need to be provided to the victims in either case. It is also important to ensure that the abuses seen in either case does not recur. And so recurrence very much needs to be part of the conversation that we have today as well. Moreover, I also want to acknowledge that the victims who have spoken out about their experiences having suffered human rights abuses, that they have often been subject to harassment as well as a degree of persecution online, but also in the real world. And this, plain and simple, is unacceptable. As I noted at the beginning of my opening remarks, the courage that it takes for victims to speak out against business-related human rights abuses, to share their stories, makes them not just victims, but more importantly, survivors. And it is their experiences, their negative and damaging experiences, that we as a society are able to find ways to grow, to ensure that these problems do not recur, and that they are able to meet and receive the justice that they deserve. And so as my final point here, I would like to emphasize that the establishment of an independent national human rights institution in Japan would serve to address many of the issues identified in our report and which I have touched here today. A national human rights institution would help to close a significant gap when it comes to state-led efforts to promote business respect for human rights and to enforce corporate accountability. Indeed, the working group identified in our report an opportunity for increased government and private sector efforts to address the continued lack of access to remedy for the cases of workers associated with Smile Up, previously named Johnny and Associates, who were victims of sexual abuse and exploitation, and for workers involved in the cleanup of the Fukushima Daiichi Nuclear Power Plant, who were employed by subcontractors of the Tokyo Electric Power Company, or TEPCO. But there were also other cases that we heard about where access to remedy remains uneven and where those impacted still are waiting for justice to be served. And so if Japan were to establish a national human rights institution, this again would help to enhance the remediation of business-related human rights abuses. For these and other cases, it would help to facilitate interagency coordination on human rights issues, and it would also help to promote business and human rights training for private sector actors, but also for auditors, judges, and public defenders. And all of this is necessary when it comes to ensuring that the implementation of the guiding principles is realized in Japan, because this would be of benefit not just only to Japan, but it would also help to set higher standards for the region when it comes to ensuring business respect for human rights. Again, the working group notes that the issues that we covered may well represent many more, a sample of the many issues that Japanese society continues to face when it comes to the business and human rights space. And so we also acknowledge that in many respects, the work that we have is not yet done. And indeed, the work that many of you in the room today are continuing to do, that work is extremely important. And so for the working group, we will continue to keep monitoring the situation on the ground in Japan. And we very much look forward to working together with all stakeholders, those in the room today, those online, but those elsewhere, to ensure that the future that Japan has is a sustainable one and one that puts at the heart of development human rights and the respect for human dignity. And so with that, I will hand back over to the floor or to my colleagues in the room. And thank you very much again for the time today. And I very much look forward to hearing all of the interventions and the experiences that colleagues will be sharing. Thank you again.
Thank you very much for this insightful introduction to ongoing issues. I think we can continue talking more deeply about those issues. Mr. Nihongi, would you like to?
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Akimasa Nihongi. I would like to thank Human Rights Now, Human Rights Watch, and the Geneva Press Club for their efforts in making this side event possible. I would also like to thank the Business and Human Rights Working Group once again for coming to Japan last year to conduct research and for shedding light on the issue of sexual assault in Japan. I have come here today to represent the many victims of the former Johnny's sexual assault issue. This issue has been neglected in Japanese society for more than half a century and has never been treated as a human rights issue. The BBC and other international media outlets have taken up the issue, and the Business and Human Rights Working Group has visited Japan to investigate the situation, which has led to rapid developments. We survivors have received courage and encouragement from the international community so far. And with more help, we have been able to go even farther. We cannot let this issue fade into the past, as it has resulted in nearly 1,000 victims experiencing horrific sexual acts at a very young age. Johnny Kitagawa was a man of great social standing. He was deified and praised by the public as a great entertainment producer. Moreover, as children at the time, it was very difficult for us to complain about the sexual harm we suffered from such a person. At the time, the Japanese media never reported on the sexual abuse of young talents by Johnny Kitagawa. Furthermore, the sexual assault of boys was not seen as a problem in society. I had lost hope that my voice would ever be heard, even if I had complained publicly about my sexual abuse. I am sure there are other victims who felt the same way. Many victims still suffer from trauma and depression because of the sexual assault and the slander they have received because of their testimonies. The effects of the sexual assault continues to destroy their lives, even now that the victims are adults. It is said that it takes a very long time for victims of sexual abuse to be able to stand up and tell others about what had happened to them during childhood. For many years, I myself was unable to disclose my sexual victimization. However, when my son was born last year, and I became a parent, and I saw the first witness, Mr. Kawan Okamoto, testifying in the media, I could no longer remain silent about this issue. Myself and the other victims feel that Smile Up has made some progress in acknowledging the fact of sexual assault and apologizing to the victims. On the other hand, we hope that Smile Up will provide compensation, emotional and mental care, and support to every last victim, so that no one is left behind. It is no longer possible to change the past. However, we believe that it will be important for society as a whole to take action to prevent such a horrific act from reoccurring. We call on Smile Up to provide full redress for victims and take effective measures to ensure that child sexual abuse is never repeated. We call on the Japanese media to report sexual abuse cases accurately and not to hide them from the public. We call on corporations not to prioritize profits to the extent that they ignore victims and give preferential treatment to perpetrators. Sadly, victims who report abuse are relentlessly slandered and harassed online and elsewhere. I moved to Ireland to protect my family, and at least one victim took his own life due to the pain of flashbacks and online harassment after telling his story. Steps must be taken to end slander and harassment. If people are slandered for testifying about their victimization, then no one will be able to speak out about their victimization. We call on the Japanese government and corporations to take these and all other necessary measures to realize a society where children are protected. Victims of sexual assault must no longer be ignored, harassed, and silenced. We must end the tendency to make it seem as if social status and talent make it acceptable to do anything. Children are the hope for the future of the whole world. We must not harm them and deprive them of their future. Once again, children are to be protected in the world we live in. Together with the international community, we want to eradicate child sexual abuse from our world. Together, we can build a world where children can grow up healthy and happy. We hope that you, the international community, will continue to watch over this issue, and we would like to work with you towards a complete solution to these challenges. Thank you very much for listening to me today.
Thank you very much, Nihongi-san, for sharing your story. It was very, very touching. Now we will move to another subject, which is Fukushima. And I would like to invite Ms. Sonoda, who's been fighting for representation about the issue of Fukushima. She's a Fukushima refugee IDP, and I give her the floor right now.
Thank you very much. I would like to share this slide. I am an evacuee from the Fukushima nuclear disaster. I would like to thank everyone involved in the side event, and I appreciate the report on Japan by the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. I was living in Fukushima with my husband and child. We lived in a beautiful environment with a strong community. It was a fantastic place for children to grow up healthy and supported. Many families like mine had lived there for many generations. In March 2011, a mega earthquake, a giant tsunami, and the Fukushima nuclear disaster attacked the east of Japan. We were confused and in fear of the nuclear disaster, which had the same record level 7 as Chernobyl. The Fukushima nuclear disaster created more than 160,000 IDPs, and even now, 31,000 IDPs are officially recorded. Some are still suffering socially and economically, many with physical and mental difficulties without the government support. Many voluntary evacuees are mothers and children. The gender gap in Japan increased the difficulties experienced by female IDPs. Japan was 125th out of the 146 countries in the gender gap index last year. In Japan, women often find it difficult to find a full-time job, and the job options are limited, so they struggled financially. The lack of support for single mothers and lone parents lead to poverty. Also, many voluntary IDP families were separated, with the husband remaining at home for work, and only the wife and children evacuating outside of Fukushima. The gendered division of labor is reinforced in such families by the fact that the wife quit her job to evacuate and then look on childcare responsibilities alone at the unfamiliar evacuation site, while the husband had very little time to spend with his family. There have been cases of evacuees committing suicide or divorcing as a result of the financial and psychological hardship, but official support wasn't provided regarding work. Many evacuee farmers were living in proudly producing foods for supporting our lives, but many of them had to give up farming due to the nuclear disaster. This was because official agricultural support at the evacuation destination didn't enable them to generate enough income. The government should have led by preparing prime substitute lands with the necessary facilities, technology, and machinery to farm it for those individual farmers who needed it. When we flew to evacuate in 2011, a worker for TEPCO is the owner of the Fukushima nuclear plant, was the same flight as us. And he said to me, "I'm going to see my parents for a couple of days. My boss let me to go to see my parents before entering inside the Fukushima nuclear plant." He was quite young. Somebody needed to go, but there was no guarantee that he would survive. Since then, thousands of workers have been working in the destroyed nuclear plant with a high risk of health problems from exposure to radiation every day. This will continue for hundreds of years. Since the disaster, there have been many accidents involving workers at the plant. 14 workers have now been certified by the Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare as having suffered work-related illness due to exposure to radiation from the Fukushima nuclear plant. However, we don't know how many were rejected. Last October, 4 workers were exposed to highly contaminated water after a hose came off in the processing system called Alpus. Especially a young worker in his 20s was highly exposed to radiation. Each construction company working inside the Fukushima nuclear plant has different safety measures for their workers. So it is necessary to ensure that occupational safety and radiation exposure protection are constantly observed to prevent illness. And that in the event of the accident, workers' compensation is promptly authorized and paid. About 370 Fukushima children have been diagnosed with thyroid cancer, many needing multiple operations and lifelong medication. Difficult symptoms disrupt ordinary life, including finding work impossible. In some cases, cancer has spread to other parts of the body and developed abnormally quickly. It is so cruel that the government doesn't support them as they need. Therefore, 7 of them even had to file a lawsuit against TEPCO. Over 12,000 evacuees have filed more than 30 class actions, either against TEPCO as a solo defendant or TEPCO and the government as joint defendants, including the trial for recovering their jobs. But the plaintiffs are seen domestically as being selfish in claiming their rights. The guiding principle on internal displacement has been ignored. In 2017, housing support for IDPs were terminated, and some IDPs who are ill and even unable to work, were sued to force eviction by Fukushima Prefecture instead of supporting them. Many countries and experts are against the Japanese government's decision to release radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean for the next 30 years. The majority of Fukushima authorities object. Also, hundreds of citizens filed a lawsuit to stop it as a violation of UNCLOS and the London Convention. The contaminated water at Fukushima contains many nuclei that touched the debris after the accident. The government neglects the risk of tritium and other nuclei, including strontium-90, in the water, and ignores viable alternative methods. They should respect the UPR recommendation about this issue and joint communications by the special rapporteurs. Last year, the former special rapporteur on IDP stated that mandatory and voluntary evacuees are IDPs with the same rights, but voluntary evacuees are criticized by the government as if they damage economy and nation. The Fukushima nuclear disaster hasn't ended yet. The victims' ongoing suffering is still treated as their own responsibility. I urge the government to respect the report by the working group and support all Fukushima nuclear victims with a durable solution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mitsuko Sonoda, for your speech. Now I would like to have from Human Rights Watch, Mr. Kasai, who will discuss about the issues of Japanese companies in Myanmar and China. Thank you very much.
Everyone, I hope you can hear me. Please let me know if you have difficulty hearing me. My name is Teppei Kasai, and I'm a program officer for the Asia Division at Human Rights Watch. Special thanks to Human Rights Now, the Geneva Press Club, among others, for providing us this space to discuss business and human rights in Japan. As many of you may know, Human Rights Watch is an international human rights organization with its headquarters in New York and offices around the world, including one in Tokyo, which opened in 2009. One of my mandates is to monitor the Japanese government's foreign policy towards countries, particularly in Asia. Within this mandate includes how major Japanese companies are conducting or failing to conduct responsible and rights-respecting business practices overseas, particularly in reference to the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights. In the interest of time, I will present two examples of major Japanese companies that are investing in Myanmar and China, and how they have failed to adhere to the guiding principles, as well as Japan's own guidelines on business and human rights. I will then present concrete recommendations on what Japan should do to avoid such mistakes from happening again. The first case is Yokogawa Bridge, a major Japanese construction company specializing in bridge construction. In 2019, the company signed a deal with the Japanese government to carry out construction of a bridge aid project in Myanmar. However, in September 2019, a fact-finding mission established by the UN Human Rights Council advised foreign companies investing in Myanmar to refrain from doing business with Myanmar military-owned conglomerates, including the Myanmar Economic Corporation, as doing so would financially fuel the military's atrocities against the Rohingya ethnic minority. Despite this warning, Yokogawa Bridge signed a deal with MEC as a subcontractor 2 months after the FFM's report was published. Since the 2021 military coup, Human Rights Watch has reached out to Yokogawa Bridge multiple times, seeking transparency and opportunities for dialogue. However, they have repeatedly told us they don't comment on individual projects, a common excuse used by many Japanese companies with an international presence. Last year, Human Rights Watch published research showing how Yokogawa Bridge has transferred millions in US dollars to MEC for the bridge aid project, meaning that a Japanese government aid project meant to benefit the ordinary people of Myanmar is actually benefiting the Myanmar's junta. During a recent Diet session, Japan's Foreign Ministry revealed Yokogawa Bridge is expected to make further payments to MEC, despite criticism by Human Rights Watch, local Diet members, and the press. The second case involves global car makers, including Japan's Toyota. Earlier this year, Human Rights Watch released a report revealing that Toyota and other global car makers are failing to minimize the risk of Uyghur forced labor being used in their aluminum supply chains. The link between Xinjiang, a region in northwestern China, the aluminum industry, and forced labor is the Chinese government-backed labor transfer programs, which coerce Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims into jobs in Xinjiang and other regions. Human Rights Watch reviewed online Chinese state media articles, company reports, and government statements and found credible evidence that aluminum producers in Xinjiang are participating in labor transfers. Car companies have a responsibility under the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights to identify, prevent, and mitigate the presence of forced labor and other human rights abuses in their supply chains. The high level of repression and surveillance in Xinjiang, including threats to workers and auditors, makes it impossible for companies to credibly investigate allegations of forced labor and consider potential remediation. However, even after Human Rights Watch wrote a letter to Toyota in 2023, the Japanese automaker did not respond. To ensure Japanese companies such as Yokogawa Bridge and Toyota do not resort to non-responses and lack of transparency and dialogue, there are steps the Japanese government should take. First, in 2022, Japan's Trade Ministry published guidelines on business and human rights, the first of its kind in Japan. However, these guidelines are entirely voluntary, meaning companies aren't legally obligated to follow them, including human rights due diligence. There's a limit to voluntary action by companies. The Japanese government should make the guidelines legally binding so that companies like Yokogawa Bridge and Toyota don't deflect or ignore dialogue with external stakeholders, and as a result, neglect transparency. Secondly, the Japanese government should establish a national human rights institution, which should also handle matters related to business and human rights, including providing redress to victims of serious rights abuses. And finally, Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida should reinstate a high-ranking Prime Minister advisor position on international human rights issues, which was effectively abolished during the second cabinet reshuffle last year. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much for your insightful remarks. I would now like to give the floor to my Vice President, Madame Ito.
Thank you very much for all panelists for insightful remarks. My name is Kazuko Ito, Vice President of Human Rights now. So thank you very much for the working group for issuing such a comprehensive report on the business and human rights in Japan, which is highly valuable for Japanese society as a whole. Human Rights Now is a Tokyo-based international human rights NGO. Our work is to promote and protect human rights globally and with special focus in Asia. And we have different thematic issues, including business and human rights. So we have conducted the investigation of human rights violation of the global supply chain of that Japanese company business in garment sector, fishing sector, construction sectors, ICT sector, and general trading companies. And we urge the company to take responsibility in accordance with the UN Guiding Principle on Business and Human Rights. Today, I'd like to take this opportunity to talk about the 4 points. The first, the general status of the business and human rights in Japan. And second, the situation of the at-risk groups. And third, global value chain problem. And lastly, how to tackle the structural issues. The first, that it is true that Japan has several positive steps to measure to implement the UNGPs, including the National Action Plan and voluntary guideline of human rights due diligence. However, these are all voluntary approach, which has significant limitations for implementation of the UNGPs. So that is why that working group correctly pointed out the serious concern over the effective implementation of the human rights due diligence across the value chain in Japan. According to the Keidanren, a business association in Japan, many companies have now started to implement the UNGP. However, in reality, the most companies have only adopted the human rights policies and just announced that they are starting to do the human rights due diligence. That's it. And the company's actions are superficial and insufficient, and mostly missing the important component of the HLDD, such as a dialogue with rights holders, establishment of the grievance mechanism, and the disclosure of the action to the public. This is especially serious when it comes to the local companies and SMEs throughout Japan. But even larger companies are not doing good at all. The secondary, that working group highlights the situation of at-risk groups, such as women, LGBT persons with disability, minority, etc. in the very detailed manner. We really appreciate that. And we call both the government and company to take this remark very seriously to each manner at the top priority of the HLDD. I want to touch on the several areas. The sexual assault and the Johnny Kitagawa agency represent pattern of the society where the powerful people in business cover up the human rights violation and sexual abuses. The working group described the situation as culture of impunity. The government survey showed that 30% of female workers are victims of sexual violence and sexual harassment. The group of women in management and key decision-making positions helps Japanese business create a sexist and harmful environment for women on a daily basis. In the entertainment industry, Johnny's case is really serious, but at the same time, this is just a tip of iceberg. In the filming industry, the actor and actress are raising their voices of sexual assault by directors. Also, sexual abuse and exploitation of women and minors are prevailing throughout the entertainment industry. But everyone turned a blind eye to solve the structural problem. So in the case of Johnny's agency, a grievance mechanism was established, but it did not meet the criteria of the UNGP, such as fairness, accessibility, and transparency. There are survivors who are denied relief without being given any reason at all. To redress that matter, I would like to propose an industry-wide grievance mechanism to be established in the industry. The situation of the foreign technical intern from Southeast Asia has been condemned as modern slavery with their heavy debt and lack of the rights. Recently, it was revealed that female technical intern from Cambodia was treated like a sex slave by farm owners in Japan, where she worked. However, it is not isolated incident. We have many of these kind of incidents. And hate speech against minorities is also a serious matter, including Korean residents, transgender persons, and persons with disabilities. Especially, the people with disability have been seriously online harassed after claiming that they have been refused service by business. And individuals stand up for their rights, such as Nihongi-san, are subjected to serious online violence. Underlying the problem is lack of awareness and respect for human rights of vulnerable people. There is a serious gap in between the international human rights standards and reality in Japan, and the government is reluctant to fill such gap. So let me turn to the global value chain issues. As a working group report points out, Japan ranks second in the world in its economic environment with the risk of modern slavery, including child labor. Moreover, Human Rights Now monitors Japanese business relationship with Myanmar, Ukraine, Gaza, and Uyghur Xinjiang region. And we find that many companies in Japan continue to have a connection to serious human rights abuses, such as genocide, war crime, forced labor, and without sufficient explanation to the public at all. Lastly, I'd like to propose how to tackle this kind of problem. So we are thankful to the working group for making comprehensive recommendations to Japan. I totally agree that there is an urgent need to fully dismantle structure of inequality and discrimination against at-risk people. To do so, I want to highlight a number of critical issues in the recommendations. First, we think that the voluntary approach is not enough. So if the government and business continue to ignore reality on the ground and stick to the ineffective voluntary approach, that will put the many rights holders in serious risk. Now is the time to enact a mandatory human rights due diligence law. The law should include the government's role for capacity building and supervising. The government should also be obliged to conduct the human rights due diligence in its own business relations, including overseas development projects. Second, it is necessary to establish a national human rights institution independent from the government. This institution should play an important role in providing effective remedy for the business of human rights violations in a prompt manner. And third, the government must fully incorporate international human rights standards and norms and change its negative attitude towards the recommendation made by the UN human rights bodies. The government must make greater effort to eliminate discrimination and promote international human rights standards amongst people and companies. So Japan needs structural change in human rights policies, ratification of the optional protocol of the major human rights treaties, and the establishment of comprehensive legislation to prohibit discrimination are very important and should be immediately implemented. I hope the BHR agenda will be a catalyst to change its long-standing vicious cycle of human rights violation in Japan in positive manner. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ito, for your remarks. I'll now invite the chairperson of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, Mr. McCorquodale, for the closing remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Calvin. Good afternoon. My name is Robert McCorquodale. I'm currently the chair of the Working Group on Business and Human Rights. And I'd like to begin by thanking Human Rights Now, by thanking Geneva Press Club, and all of those involved in the organisation and hosting this event, and those who participated. I also want to thank the other panel members for their thoughts and their engagement and their bringing to life some of these issues, but also for their close reading of our report. My colleague Pichamon Yeophantong has already given some excellent remarks, and I don't wish to cover again any of the issues which she's already raised, as she's covered the main points of our country visit report. So I just want to have a few closing remarks. The visit to Japan by the Working Group has highlighted both significant advancements and critical challenges in the country's journey towards implementing the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Japan's development of a national action plan and the issuance of guidelines on responsible business conduct in supply chains are commendable steps forward. These initiatives demonstrate a strong commitment to integrating human rights considerations into business practices and promoting responsible business conduct at national and international levels. However, despite these positive developments, considerable work remains to be done. The gaps in human rights due diligence, especially among small and medium-sized enterprises, highlight the need for targeted guidance and capacity building. The persistent issues of workplace discrimination and harassment against marginalised groups underscore the importance of ongoing efforts to promote diversity, inclusion, and equal treatment in the workplace. Additionally, the establishment of a national human rights institution and the enhancement of grievance mechanisms are essential elements to ensure that victims of business-related human rights abuses have access to effective remedies. As we move forward, it's crucial for the Japanese government and for businesses and civil society and all relevant stakeholders to continue working collaboratively on this matter. By building on the foundations laid by the current initiatives and addressing its challenges, Japan can strengthen its leadership in promoting human rights within the business sector and set a powerful example for other countries both in the region and elsewhere. We look forward to seeing these efforts translate into concrete actions that uphold and protect the human rights of all individuals impacted by business activities. The working group reiterates its continued commitment to support Japan in the development and implementation of improved business and human rights practices. The country visit to Japan is just one of many tools available under the special procedures mandate, which includes the working group, to promote and protect human rights. This visit marks the beginning, not the end, of our efforts collaboratively. We encourage stakeholders in Japan to use our communication procedures, which are available and easily accessible on our website, to report human rights abuses which they encounter in relation to business activities. In addition, the working group provides various resources and reports to assist stakeholders in this journey. For instance, just this afternoon, I presented our latest thematic report on investors, ESG and human rights. It's a very relevant issue, of course, to Japan. And our next report, presented to the General Assembly, will address protecting and respecting the rights of LGBT+ people in the context of business activities, which is particularly relevant, of course, given our observations in our report to Japan. We're committed to ongoing dialogue and to support to ensure that all vulnerable groups are protected and respected in business practices. As part of this ongoing dialogue, I encourage all participants here and online to join the Asia Pacific Forum in Bangkok, Thailand, from the 24th to the 27th of September this year. The theme will be the Remedy Blueprint, Bridging Gaps and Accelerating Access. I'd also like to inform you that the Working Group's annual forum on business and human rights will be held here in Geneva from the 25th to the 27th of November under the theme Realising the Smart Mix of Measures to Protect Human Rights in the Context of Business Activities. We encourage you to participate in the regional and the global forum and to continue our engagement with us. I'd like to conclude by thanking once again all the stakeholders who participated in the open and constructive discussions before, during and after our country visit to Japan that definitely helped to inform our report. And on behalf of the working group, thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here and for your remarks, and of course for your hard work. Thank you. I will now pass the floor to everyone in the room and online for a Q&A session. Please feel free to ask some questions, present yourself maybe, and I see someone, yes?
Thank you. My name is Sanae Fujita from University of Essex. Thank you very much for the wonderful presentation, and I'm so grateful for your very holistic report. I was involved in the preparation last spring since you are still preparing the country visit, so I'm so grateful for your effort to cover such a lot of issues in Japan with human rights. However, I think unfortunately that the coverage by the media and generally looks like just only for the Chinese issue so far. And it's a bit disappointing to think about what you have done in Japan and compared to the holistic, such a broad report. And it's disappointing, even a bit of misleading for me. So what do you think about this? If you have any recommendation, comment on that. And my second question to the working group is paragraph 66 of your report, which you are emphasizing importance of the labor union's role. During your visit and working group visit, you were able to conduct an interview to one of the labor union. And that was very shocking case. The people arrested because they did some strikes. But behind that case, at that time, nobody was able to. I was involved in the information provided in this case and from abroad. But behind this case, there's a much more broad issue, structural issue in Japan, which I didn't know at that time. Over the decade, Japanese labor union, which is an industrial labor union, has been destroyed, weakened over decades, then replaced with enterprise-based union that makes workers to have a solidarity across the company is very hard. So, but this issue not very well recognized as a human rights issue in Japan, and kind of neglected even in the human rights community. So from now on, we really have to look at that. But how important, how essential it is for your mandate, and if you have a recommendation, comment on that to human rights community and maybe media as well. So I'll be grateful for hearing any comments for these 2 points. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other question? No? Oh, sorry.
Thank you for taking my questions. I'm a Japanese journalist, and first of all, I'm apologize disappointing and misleading report. So. And my question is, Robert-san, what kind of topic is more focused on in the working group to iron out the report? Your report covers a wide variety of topics. So how was the discussion going on in the working groups? So thank you.
Could you clarify your question, please?
What kind of topic is the discussion was focused on? What topics? In the report, in your report, you cover many topics from the ESG, Japanese minority groups, disabled, and the women gender problem. Which topic is more controversial in the working group? Thank you.
Yes, please.
So, my name is Mitsuko from the Asahi newspaper company, and I would like to ask you to the president and Nihongi-san. And to the president, my question is: so Japan is known as the G7 countries, the world's big economic giant. But what surprised you the most about the report? So other foreign media reporters told me that it's surprising that Japan have human rights issues. So maybe Japan has a clear, the image that clean society. So for you, what is the most surprising about the report? And to the Nihongi-san, probably there is already there's a question in the today's Ichiji, the 1 o'clock press press opportunity, but I would like to ask you about what is this today's meeting? What is the meaning, or for you, today's meeting of the Human Rights Council? Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Firstly, for the first question, thank you. I thank you too for your help in our engagements and discussions while the working group was in Japan. It's enormously valuable to have someone with your expertise and knowledge when one begins conducting a country visit. You are quite right to say that, of course, our report covers a huge number of areas, and that Johnny and Associates is one, an important area, but not the only area, and we do respect enormously those who are affected by it. To them, that's incredibly important, and we respect that. Of course, you are concerned that the media interest has been there because of this focus. I guess in any human rights report, it's great to have media interest. There are other countries you visited which have had very little media interest from our report. So my hope is that even if this is the topic which draws in the media interest, it's certainly part of then there's a greater reading about the report, and it sees the huge variety of issues which we cover. And you refer, of course, to paragraph 66, where we deal with issues involving labour unions. Of course, we never declare who we meet in these circumstances other than government officials. So that might be your awareness of the situation. We are much more circumspect, of course. And freedom of assembly is, of course, a key right. And labour rights very often are the first rights which alert us and others to a matter of a corporate activity which is either causing, contributing to, or directly linked to a potential or actual abuse of human rights. And so labour rights are really important often in highlighting that, and in doing that, unions are often the bodies which alert us and more generally the media about these issues. So there's a great value in unions to be able to find out what is happening, and particularly if we care about meaningful stakeholder engagement, very often unions can provide that, as well as alert companies and others to who else should be considered in that stakeholder engagement. In relation to your question about what is a priority, as somebody who's worked in human rights for many decades, I never prioritise human rights. Every human right is important. So for Mr. Nihongi, the human rights he had abuse, they are the most important right for him. So we as a working group do not prioritise between one kind of human rights over another. They are all important. What may happen in our report is we may focus on certain things because we are very limited in the space which we are allowed to produce a report. We're limited in trying to highlight what we might consider to be issues which are more systemic or generic, and therefore it's not a matter of which prioritising human rights, it might be a matter of alerting broad-based issues which we are concerned about. In relation to your question about what surprised us about the report, I guess I'd start from the same basis. No country in the world is free of abuse on human rights. Once again, I've been in this field long enough to know that you can't point to any country which hasn't had a record where we can see examples where there's been violations of human rights. In a bigger context, of course, the understanding of corporate responsibility to respect human rights is relatively recent. I first began in this 30 years ago, and I can tell you when I would speak to governments, when I would speak to companies about corporate responsibility for human rights, they'd say, doesn't exist. It's the only ones that have responsibility in the areas are governments. So the fact that 30 years later we are talking about this is a fantastic development. The fact that we can say this company is not doing this, and in doing so it's breaching human rights, is an extraordinary development. So I'm astonished if countries are doing anything at all on this, because we are still at an early stage. I would love there to be a much greater and quicker development, and so we all get frustrated if we're not yet at that stage. But I do think it's not surprising at all to me that Japan or any of the other countries you visit, there are significant problems still in this area because it's relatively new, and it's also an area where governments particularly are still working out what their role is. Very often they think it's only a corporate role. It is both. And I think, therefore, I can't say, sorry, I will start again. I can't say there was anything in particular that surprised me. Also, we do an awful lot of work before we go to country visits. So I guess I would just encourage the governments such as Japan who are doing something on human rights and still say there's a long way to go. I think I've covered those questions. Thanks. I think there was a question to me.
Yes, I'll try my best to answer the question in English, but it was very meaningful to me to attend the session this morning because first of all, no one has ever stated this issue, this as an issue in Japan, as a victim. That's what I think, and it was the Business and Human Rights Working Group and the foreign media, as I said, shed light on the issue of sexual assault in Japan. So, and secondly, it was very meaningful for us to bring our voices and taking it to the place where the international community gathers. Yes, it was very meaningful to me.
Can I just note that I hadn't realised my excellent colleague Pichamon was still online, which is deeply impressive because it's now some terrible time in the early morning for her. So if there's anything you wish to add to my questions, because you had the experience of being there in Japan, please do add that. I'm sorry, I wasn't aware you were online still. Did you want to add anything to answer any of the questions, Pichamon?
Thanks for that, Robert. I mean, I agree with everything that you have said. I agree that when it comes to human rights, there's no single one that takes priority over another one. All human rights are important. And as we all know, a negative impact on one human right has a cascading effect on other human rights. That is how they are indivisible and interconnected. I also wanted to address the point made about how during our visit, a lot of media attention was directed to the case of Smile Up and the victims. And I wanted to reiterate here that victims, the stories that they tell, deserve as much coverage as much coverage as possible. Because to me, what was surprising was how this issue has been covered up for so long, and how access to effective remedy has not been provided yet to these victims. But again, it's not just this case, it's many other cases that we looked at as well. And so I generally hope that the media attention that has been generated in relation to the Smile Up issue will also help to shed light and raise awareness about the other topics that haven't been receiving as much coverage in the media or as much attention in the public eye in Japan or indeed globally. And as mentioned in my remarks, these are issues ranging from PFAS contamination, the lack of access to remedy on the part of Fukushima workers, the challenges faced by migrant workers, and as the colleague in the room pointed out, of labor unions as well, and of course the urgent need for Japan to establish an independent national human rights institution. And I'm quite pleased to see that following the release of our full country visit report, that there are more media outlets now that have been covering other aspects that we looked at in our report. And to see the discussions that have emerged in relation to those topics, I think are very helpful and will hopefully contribute to an even richer discussion about the human rights situation in Japan more broadly. But I would say that's what I would like to add to your excellent responses already, Robert. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there any other questions in the room? Yes, sir. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and I'm delighted to be here to learn more about business and human rights in Japan. I've got two questions, one for Robert, one for Ito. My question on, because I'm from Iraq, my name is Mohammed. Do we report to the business working group if we see, let's say, Japanese companies violate human rights in Iraq? Do we include this in your report, or you look at it separately as in Japan only? And Yoto, Mr. Robert mentioned about the religious minority. Is there any discrimination against religious minority within businesses in Japan? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question from online. So here it is. About PFAS of the paragraph 62 and 63 of the report. As a resident of a heavily PFAS contaminated region near Osaka, I appreciate your comment. Additional measures are needed at the national level to address PFAS contamination and its negative health effects in all affected regions. Yesterday, on the 25th of June, the Food Safety Commission of Japan released its report and spelled out the tolerable daily intake of PFAS through food for the first time. It recommends a limit of 20 nanograms each in PFOA and PFOS per kilogram of body weight per day. The Commission concluded that while PFAS had some health risk, the evidence supporting the risk was either insufficient or limited. The Japanese government has been investing trillions of yen in our tax money into semiconductor factories where PFAS and clean water are essential. Osaka and surrounding area in Kansai, which has been contaminated by daikin or related wastes, are likely to be left as they are without any additional measures. Do you think companies that make profits at the expense of our health and the environment can survive in the global supply chain? Thank you. That's it.
Okay, I will answer the first question from Mohammed, and my colleague Pichamon might be able to answer the second one if she's still available. So yes is the answer. If there's a Japanese company operating in another state, absolutely that's relevant for our work, always. And sometimes we then, in our country visits, talk to that Japanese company in Japan about what they're doing elsewhere in the world. That is a very normal aspect of a country visit. But similarly, most of our communications will concern some transnational elements. So, for example, we might engage in a South American country about a North American company which is operating in that country. So that certainly our experience is very much that the companies are very often companies which are external to the particular country where the complaint or the abuse is being complained about. At the same stage, if it's abuse within that country itself, we'd also be interested. So it's not just limited to within the country. I don't know, Pichamon, are you still here? If not,
I'm still here.
Oh, good. Do you want to answer the question about PFAS?
Sure. I can take a stab at it, which is to say that for companies that put profit before people, or as the person who posed the question put it, at the expense of people's health and the environment, I would say that it's going to become ever more difficult for them to survive in the global supply chain, in the global market. Because what we've seen as a working group is that legislation related to business and human rights in relation to mandatory human rights due diligence is on the rise. We're also seeing how investors, as my colleague Robert pointed out in his remarks earlier today at the Human Rights Council, investors are also paying much more attention now to the human rights, the social impacts, and the environmental impacts of the companies within which they invest. Double materiality in ESG, environmental, social, and governance reporting requirements is also on the rise in terms of various stock exchanges and the measures they're putting in place. So altogether, it's going to become much more difficult now and into the future for companies to put profit ahead of people's human rights. And this is something that I think underscores how we are making progress. Again, as my colleague Robert pointed out, we are making progress. But at the same time, it is still important to ensure that there are robust legal frameworks in place so that issues like PFAS contamination are rapidly and sufficiently addressed by government as primary duty bearer, but also by the businesses involved. Thanks.
Hi, thank you very much for your questions. We have discrimination against the Muslim community in Japan. This is not necessarily related to the business association, but the government conducts some constant surveillance against Muslim communities. After 9/11, that the Muslim community, some of the Muslim community are mistakenly deemed as potential terrorists by the Japanese, the police, and then there is constant surveillance against that. And then some of the, public defender's office started the class action, and then so, the sue the police and the government. But Supreme Court turned down the decision, so they cannot get the effective remedy. That's another, the problem in Japan. So we have not only the business-related human rights violation, but also that, the many area of the discrimination against minority. Thank you very much for your pointing that. Very important point.
So thank you, everyone. This concludes our dialogue, our great conversation on business and human rights in Japan. I would like to thank everyone for coming in today, and let's keep working hard and making the world a better place. Thank you, everyone. We have drinks and some time to talk, discuss, so please help yourself. Thank you.
Yeah,